Jerusalem, 70 CE. The temple burns, its stones cracking in the fire set by Roman hands. The screams of the city rise with the smoke, but in the narrow alleys and locked rooms, something else takes place. Families huddle together, wives, daughters, mothers, speaking in whispers drowned out by the thunder of Roman engines. They know what happens when a city falls to the legions. They have seen it in Galilee, in Caesarea, in Joppa. And so, they choose. Josephus tells us of the terrible silence that followed the conquest. When the soldiers broke through, expecting plunder and captives, they found whole homes gone still. Women lying side by side, throats cut not by Roman swords but by their own hands, or the hands of fathers who could not bear to see them in chains. Archaeologists excavating cellars around the city walls found skeletons grouped in families, the charred remains of meals still on the hearth. In one room, a girl of perhaps 14, a small copper bangle still around her wrist, lay across her mother's lap, her jaw cut clean through. 3 years later, at Masada in 73 CE, it happened again. The fortress perched above the Judean desert became the final refuge of rebels and their families. As the Roman ramps crept higher, as the battering rams splintered the gates, the defenders gathered their wives and daughters. Josephus describes the speeches, freedom even in death, dignity even in despair. That night the long cries of children were silenced by blades, the women's voices replaced by the hush of steel and sobbing. When the Romans burst in at dawn, they expected a fight. They found only fire and bodies, 960 of them. Some mothers still clutched their infants, others arranged themselves in neat rows, as if daring the Romans to count them. To this day, Masada's ruins whisper of that choice, the silence of defeat turned into the scream of defiance. But Judea was not alone. A century earlier, in 133 BCE, the Iberian city of Numantia had faced the same fate. Besieged by Scipio Aemilianus, starved until their ribs showed through their skin, the Numantines chose annihilation over submission. Plutarch writes of women feeding their last bread to their children, then strangling them before putting torches to their own homes. When Rome entered, the city was ash. The soldiers searched for spoils, but all they found were blackened walls and bones curled in the posture of fire. Carthage, 146 BCE. The jewel of the Mediterranean smolders after 3 years of siege. The screams of the last defenders echo through the temple district. Polybius records the moment. The wives of Carthaginian nobles, unwilling to face Roman slavery, gathered their children in the great temple of Eshmun. They built a pyre of sacred timbers, poured oil across the altar, and set themselves alight. Roman witnesses later spoke of the stench: burned hair, burned flesh, burned hope. In the rubble, archaeologists uncovered scorched jewelry, fused glass beads, and infant bones, proof that women and children perished together rather than be taken alive. Again and again, across centuries, the same pattern repeats. Women facing Roman conquest chose the knife, the fire, the noose, the poison. Their bones tell us what the chronicles already knew: whatever waited in Roman captivity was worse. Rome did not merely conquer. It commodified. Every victory produced captives, and every captive had a price. The Forum Boarium in Rome was one of the oldest slave markets in the empire. Beneath its arches, on flagstones worn smooth by centuries of feet, wives of fallen enemies were paraded like cattle. Auctioneers shouted prices while Roman matrons examined teeth, hips, and hair. Inscriptions carved into the marble pillars recorded victories, while beside them, women from Gaul, Germania, Judea, and Africa were sold in chains. A virgin under 16 might fetch a year's wages for a legionary, while mothers with infants were valued as breeders. Those over 30 were sold cheap for field labor, their dignity stripped as surely as their clothes. Delos in the Aegean became Rome's great warehouse of flesh. Ancient writers claimed that 10,000 slaves could be sold there in a single day. Excavations have uncovered the stone foundations of pens, drainage channels to carry away waste, iron rings where chains once bit into skin. Imagine the sound: the cries of children separated from mothers, the bark of Roman overseers, the clink of coins counted as lives changed hands. Women captured in Gaul or Spain could, within weeks, find themselves displayed naked on Delian auction blocks, their names erased, their worth reduced to denarii. Ostia, Rome's port, was another hub. Warehouses stretching hundreds of feet, subdivided into pens, have been unearthed. On their plaster walls, archaeologists found scratched inscriptions, names, pleas, prayers in Greek, Punic, Hebrew. Leah was here. Christ have mercy. Remember Tullia. These faint words are the only testimony left of women who once commanded homes, who once wore jewelry, who once bore the dignity of wives. Now they were merchandise, waiting for Roman households, farms, or brothels to claim them. This was not random brutality. It was organized, industrial. Captives were marched in files, their worth calculated by age, beauty, and fertility. Auctioneers kept ledgers, fragments of which survive, lists of names beside numbers, columns of human inventory. Rome had turned the defeat of nations into an economy, and the wives of its enemies were its most prized stock. Wherever the Roman legions marched, the infrastructure of enslavement followed. Camps were not only military bases, they were also processing centers for captives. Archaeologists have found evidence of storage pens near legionary sites along the Rhine and the Danube. Stone post holes outline rectangular enclosures, with iron fittings still embedded in the rock. Drainage channels carved beneath suggest mass holding areas, human beings penned like livestock. The layout is deliberate, wide enough for a cohort of soldiers to march prisoners through, narrow enough to prevent escape. Beside these pens were the brothels. Every Roman camp had them, built from timber and stone, divided into cramped cells. Graffiti scrawled on the walls testifies to their use. Women taken in conquest, wives of Germanic chieftains, Gallic farmers' daughters, Judean priestly families, were forced into service, their bodies offered as rewards to soldiers who had butchered their men. Payment was deducted directly from legionary wages. The system was so standardized that tokens have been found, small bronze coins stamped with numbers, redeemable for time with enslaved women. At Trier, Cologne, and Vindolanda, archaeologists uncovered wooden tablets detailing rations allocated not to soldiers, but to captives. Bread, oil, and wine measured precisely to keep women alive but weak. Even the measurements of shackles reveal a system, large for men, smaller for women, smallest of all for children. Rome had perfected the machinery of mass captivity. The silence of these ruins speaks louder than triumphal arches. Where soldiers sharpened swords, women were processed, catalogued, and stripped of their futures. For noble women, fate was a spectacle. When Carthage fell, Polybius records the sight of noble women dragged through the streets in chains. Some were executed outright, but others were reserved for Rome's triumphs, the grand parade celebrating conquest. Syphax's queen walked behind the chariot of Scipio Africanus, her royal jewelry stripped away, her eyes downcast as Romans jeered. Jugurtha's family, once rulers of Numidia, were paraded in fetters before being strangled in the Tullianum prison. Cleopatra Selene, daughter of Antony and Cleopatra, survived only to be married off by Augustus as a political pawn. Berenice of Cilicia, beloved of Titus, was dismissed from Rome once politics made her inconvenient, sent away like spoiled merchandise. In every case, wives and daughters of defeated kings became living trophies. Their humiliation was as important as their capture. Rome's message was clear: no woman, no matter how noble, was beyond becoming a symbol of defeat. The triumphs themselves reveal this cruelty. Arch-reliefs, like that on the Arch of Titus, show women among the spoils, their faces etched in despair, their hands bound, their dignity obliterated in marble. They were displayed not as individuals but as emblems, proof of Rome's dominion. And when the processions ended, so did their lives. Some were sold into slavery, others given as concubines to Roman officers, a few strangled quietly in prison cells. Their names survive only in fragments, their humanity erased by the spectacle of empire. For those wives and daughters who survived the auctions, life became routine degradation. On Roman estates, enslaved women were not only laborers, they were breeders. Inscriptions from Villa Rustica sites record the numbers of births among enslaved populations. Estate managers kept tallies, ensuring that women of childbearing age produced offspring to increase the master's wealth. The children of enslaved women were automatically slaves, property from the moment of birth. Branding was common. Small iron marks burned into skin identified ownership. Some skeletons excavated in Italy show scarring patterns consistent with repeated branding. Medical texts by Roman writers, such as Celsus, include instructions for restraining women during procedures, suggesting a system where even healing was another form of control. At Pompeii and Herculaneum, the remains of villa slave quarters reveal cramped cells, some barely large enough for two people to lie down. In one, archaeologists found the skeleton of a woman alongside an infant, the child's skull still resting in the crook of her arm. They had died in the eruption of Vesuvius, but their positioning suggests a life of forced maternity, a mother holding a baby who was never hers to keep. Roman literature itself betrays the system. Satirists like Juvenal joke about masters impregnating slave women, about noble households where wives competed with enslaved concubines. The jokes mask a darker truth: reproduction was managed, coerced, and controlled. Women were commodities for labor, for pleasure, and for breeding. This was the fate of countless wives of defeated enemies. Stripped from their homes, auctioned, branded, forced to bear children for men who had killed their families. Their bloodlines vanished into the soil of Rome, their voices lost except in the faint echoes of archaeology. Rome's victories were not written only in stone. They were written into flesh, into wombs, into bloodlines that still flow across the Mediterranean and Europe. Modern genetic studies reveal what the chroniclers hinted at but rarely dared to describe: the conquest of peoples was also the conquest of women. Maternal DNA from populations in Italy, Spain, North Africa, and Britain shows high levels of ancestry from the provinces Rome subdued. Paternal lines, the Y chromosomes, often remain Roman, but the maternal lines tell another story, one of forced assimilation. In Iberia, genetic analysis reveals a surge of Italian paternal ancestry beginning in the 2nd century BCE. But the maternal DNA is local. Iberian women folded into Roman households by force. In Gaul, the same pattern emerges: Celtic female markers persist, while Roman male markers dominate. The message is clear: Roman soldiers killed men and took their wives and daughters, seeding future generations with conquest. Judea's story is the same. After 70 CE, with Jerusalem destroyed and thousands enslaved, maternal lineages carrying Jewish ancestry appear in populations across the empire, in Rome, in Carthage, in Gaul. Women torn from the Holy Land became mothers of children who would never know their origins, their prayers, their traditions. North Africa bears another scar. Genetic studies in Tunisia and Algeria reveal traces of Punic ancestry surviving through female lines, while the male lines reflect Roman and later Vandal invasions. Carthage may have burned, but Carthaginian women lived on in the bodies of their conquerors' descendants. Rome celebrated its triumphs as civilization's victories, but the DNA tells the truth. These were not marriages of choice. They were forced unions, assimilation through violation. Entire populations reshaped not by consent, but by conquest. Modern Italians carry the blood of Gauls and Greeks, modern Spaniards carry the blood of Romans and North Africans, modern British populations carry Mediterranean traces seeded by legions 2,000 years ago. The empire's greatest monument is not the Colosseum, nor the aqueducts, nor the marble roads. It is the genetic rewriting of whole nations. Women turned into the biological foundation of Rome's expansion. Their voices silenced, their cultures erased, but their bodies used to birth the next generation of empire. But not every woman accepted Rome's fate. Some fought. Some resisted in ways the legions never expected. Boudica of the Iceni is the most famous. Tacitus tells us that when Roman officers humiliated her, flogged her, and raped her daughters, she turned her grief into fury. She rose before her tribe, her long hair flowing, her voice carrying over the warriors. Behind her stood her daughters, scarred by Rome's cruelty. Before her, an army swore vengeance. The rebellion that followed burned Roman Londinium to the ground, slaughtered thousands, and sent tremors through the empire itself. Boudica was crushed in the end, but her story became a warning. The wives of the conquered might still carry knives. They might still raise armies. Rome called her a barbarian queen. Her people called her a mother who refused silence. Elsewhere resistance took quieter forms. In Pompeii, graffiti has been found scratched onto walls of slave quarters, names written in Greek, prayers to foreign gods, secret codes of solidarity. At Ostia, archaeologists uncovered amulets buried beneath thresholds, small bronze charms inscribed with eyes, hands, stars. Protective talismans hidden by women who carried their traditions even into captivity. Suicide pacts appeared across the empire. In Hispania, Livy records wives killing their children and themselves when captured, choosing ashes over chains. In Gaul, Caesar himself recounts women throwing themselves into rivers rather than fall into Roman hands. In Judea, as we have seen, entire families chose poison and steel at Masada. Escape networks flicker at the edges of Roman history. Runaway notices scratched onto wax tablets in Vindolanda speak of women who fled their masters. Rewards offered, descriptions given: brown-haired, slim, about 20 years of age, speaks Gaulish. These notices tell us that not all women stayed chained. Some vanished into forests, deserts, and mountains. Some may have joined bandit groups, others found shelter in villages that defied Rome's grasp. And in the darkest corners of the empire, hidden inscriptions whisper rebellion. Inscriptions carved into walls of quarries: Livia lives. I will return home. Inscriptions cut into pottery fragments buried with women: remember. These small acts were weapons. Proof that even in the machinery of slavery, even in Rome's vast empire, women found ways to defy erasure. What made Rome different from raiders or tribal conquerors was its bureaucracy. Rome turned atrocity into law. The Lex Aelia Sentia of 4 CE regulated slaves' manumission, controlling who could be freed, at what age, under what circumstances. A system of control dressed in legal robes. Lex Julia made adultery a crime, but masters using their female slaves were exempt. The law itself enshrined exploitation. Taxation extended Rome's cruelty into accounting. 2% was charged on every slave sold in public markets. The state profited directly from women's suffering, its officials stamping documents while wives of conquered peoples were dragged past in chains. These taxes funded roads, aqueducts, even temples. Rome's marble gleamed because women's dignity was sold and taxed. Financial instruments grew from this system. Contracts of sale survive on wax tablets: names, prices, ages, conditions. One tablet records the sale of a Gallic woman for 1,200 sesterces. Another documents the purchase of 2 Jewish sisters for 2,000. They are listed like cattle, weight and health noted, fertility implied. Rome's greatest crime was its efficiency. Enslavement was not chaos. It was standardized, documented, bureaucratized. Governors wrote reports, generals filed inventories, merchants ensured shipments of human beings. It was a machine, and at its center were the wives of Rome's enemies, processed, sold, bred, taxed, consumed. For centuries, Rome's monuments told only one story: triumph. Triumphal arches, marble inscriptions, coins stamped with images of women kneeling before emperors. But beneath these monuments, archaeology uncovers the silences. Mass graves speak where chroniclers fell quiet. At Carthage, bones of women and infants lie mingled in ash, testimony to fire and suicide. At Numantia, scorched jewelry fused to bone tells of women who chose flames. At Masada, skeletal remains still bear cut marks on ribs and throats, proof of desperate hands turning weapons inward. In Ostia and Delos, inscriptions scratched by fingernails whisper from plaster walls, names, prayers, laments. In one holding cell, a faint cross etched into stone, perhaps by a Christian woman awaiting sale. In another, Greek letters spelling Eleni, remember me. Rome never recorded their voices. Archaeology preserved them. Objects left behind cut deeper. A child's doll buried in a storage pit beneath a market. A bronze mirror cracked in half beside shackles. A comb tangled with strands of long hair, its teeth worn smooth by years of use. These are not artifacts of prosperity. They are relics of captivity, fragments of women's lives discarded in Rome's shadow. Rome buried its crimes beneath its glory. Temples rose above mass graves, markets above holding cells. The silence was deliberate. The empire wrote history in marble, but women carved their truths in scratches and ashes. 2,000 years later, the ghosts remain. Not in ruins, not in chronicles, but in blood. Modern populations in Italy, Spain, France, Britain, North Africa, all carry the genetic echoes of Rome's brutality. Celtic mothers, Iberian wives, Jewish daughters, Carthaginian queens, their DNA survives in modern descendants who will never know their names. Every test that shows Mediterranean ancestry hides a story of chains. Every lineage ending abruptly in records hides a choice, the knife, the fire, the poison, rather than captivity. Rome celebrated itself as the bringer of law, order, civilization. But the bloodlines tell another truth. Rome was also the conqueror of women, the reshaper of peoples through forced assimilation. The silence of history contrasts with the clarity of science. Archaeology uncovers the shackles, the inscriptions, and the mass graves. Genetics uncovers the missing mothers, the assimilated daughters, the blood of conquered nations hidden in Roman veins. These are not statistics. They are testimony. Testimony of women stripped, sold, violated, but who survived in the only way left to them, through their children. Rome's monuments still stand, arches and aqueducts casting long shadows. But beneath those shadows lie graves, whispers, absences. The true story of empire is not marble and triumph. It is women who chose death over slavery, women who carved their names into plaster, women whose blood flows still in modern veins. The ghosts of Roman conquest live in every descendant, in every test tube, in every strand of DNA. They remind us that the empire was not only glorious. It was horrible.